Yo, and Ailina. Buenos dias, Taos. Buenos dias, mi gente. Hi, Taos. You caught me. I got my little opening line there wrong. How you guys doing? Welcome back to In the Valle, Prejudice and Reconciliation in Taos. Today, we're here with Miss Nikesha Breeze, activist here in Taos, and also an educator here in Taos, and a performance artist herself, correct?
Yeah, and visual artist.
Digital artist, yes.
Visual.
Visual artist, visual artist, okay. Nikesha Breeze is going to give us a little bit of background about herself for those of you that might not be familiar with her. And then we're going to start our conversation. So, Nikesha, please.
Thanks. Hi. Thank you for having me. My name is Nikesha Breeze, and I moved here to Taos in 1999, so I've been here 21 years. I've raised two sons here through Taos, through school systems. We've gone through a lot of the different schools in the younger ages. Now they're both in the Taos High School. I'm a teacher at Taos Academy in their STEM department. I teach art. And I'm also an artist myself and activist that works in a lot of different nonprofits, a lot of different organizations throughout northern New Mexico, mostly teaching and sustaining social justice work, social change work, supporting youth education, racial justice trainings, and then my art itself is all about reconciliation, reclamation, and deep honoring. So that's sort of the work. I do work, I teach, and I call Taos my home.
Right on. Well, you're in the right place then. Yeah. Right on. We're glad to have you here too. Now, Nikesha, we're going to get right into things. And first question, does Taos suffer from systemic racism?
Yes, absolutely. And the whole world suffers from systemic racism. And we think it would be erroneous for any place to say they don't suffer from it. At this point, racism has infiltrated its way into almost every system of our society, of what we call our modern civilized way. Is all based ultimately on racist structures at this point that are detrimental.
How do you see that manifesting here in Taos? Like, in what ways have you noticed that?
Racism in Taos has, gone all the way back to the very beginning. Any indigenous person here would tell you that, this place is unceded territory. And so the tensions of race have come from the very first colonizers that arrived in this land. The racism, it has played its way out, I think, into all of the structures from, land rights and treaties and failed treaties and, and all of the ways that people have integrated themselves into this place and into this land. It's in everything. And it plays out in current politics. It plays out in, modern day business practices. It plays out in interpersonal relationships in the street. It plays out in contracting. It plays out in every single way that you could imagine, in Taos particularly.
Right on. What forms of prejudice, if any, have you experienced while living here in Taos?
I've experienced prejudice in Taos personally, particularly, just being a Black person in this town, which, this, again, New Mexico in general and Taos in northern New Mexico is always understood as a tricultural region, but it's actually much more widely diverse than that, and that's actually a form of racism, even to believe that it is just that. And so I've always felt very much on the outside as a Black body here. Even being here 21 years, I get questions all the time about, where me basically not belonging here. Like, where do you come from? Why are you here? And how are you here? I walk into places and I'm a celebrity because I'm the only Black person. People all know who I am when I walk around, or they all have seen me before. So there's an isolation that happens just being Black. I'm not the only Black person. There's many Black people in this town. There's many in this whole region for a very long time.
Yes.
And, my family actually, I can trace my family into some of the first settlers, Black settlers in New Mexico. My family were one of the original landowners in Blackdom, New Mexico, which is outside of Roswell. So we came in the early 1800s, walking from slave plantations in North Carolina, through Texas, and then settling in Blackdom. And so there's actually very interesting cross histories, that happen here with Black stories, and my roots go all the way back to that. So I've been here 20 years, and then realized, even 10 years ago that my family has been from these lands too.
That's awesome.
Which is awesome.
That is awesome. Because for myself, being somebody that was born and raised in Taos, and yes, I do approach people that I do not recognize, that I have yet to meet with that kind of same. I mean, when you first got here, I asked you what your connection to Taos was and what brings you here, and I do apologize for asking that.
No, but that's. I want to correct myself really quickly there, because I feel like any Indigenous person to this land has the right to ask me, like, who are you and where do you come from? And I feel honored actually to be able to say, like, yes, I'm here as, in this place as somebody that is humbly, in total recognition that, I too am a settler,
Well, that's the key term though, settler, not a colonizer.
Right.
So yes, I understand, like you were explaining how your family got here.
Yeah.
Totally would have done the same thing had I been in your family's situation those hundreds of years ago.
Right.
Find a new beginning, find a new path, find a new life, find a fresh start. But still, I digress, and I still want to apologize, because even as a Native American person, as an Indigenous person, someone with deep ancestral ties to this land, to me, after you said that, I realized that is kind of a little rude of me to ask, and it is something for us locals. We really should stop asking questions like that of people that we don't recognize, or people that haven't been in our community so long, because at one point or another, you're still a contributing part of our community, and that is important.
Yeah.
And your input should be recognized on the same level as mine, on the same level as one of the Cordovas or one of the Trujillos, one of those families that had one of those original 60-some families from the original land grant.
Right. Your
contribution should be recognized as equal. So that being said, let's move forward.
Yeah.
Right? Let's keep going the conversation. So thank you. And this is one that I've really been kind of chomping at the bit to ask you particularly. Do you see any reflections of the past or from the past in the current state of civil unrest that the country is going through right now with Black Lives Matters and the problems that are occurring in like Portland and the riots that are occurring across the country? Do you see any reflections from the past and what's going on today?
Yeah, I mean, it's rife with reflections from the past. It's, often it feels like a repeating bad movie, that we're still, people who were protesting in the streets in the 60s or, are still protesting in the 20s with the Tulsa race massacres. For Black people, we have been in resistance and also Indigenous people, but particularly like with Black Lives Matter, like the fight for our rights has been continual and come up in many different ways. And there's people who've never stopped fighting. The resistance has never ended towards, racial justice. This right now, the huge uprising and a necessary uprising that's happened across the world, for Black life has come, I think, it's interesting. I want to pull back. There's so many times when people talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, they say, why now? Or like, why is this happening now? And like, didn't we have a lot of progress? Like, aren't Black people equal to everyone else, in a certain way? And go ahead. In
a certain way, yeah. But in a lot of ways, still, no.
A lot of ways, no. One of the things that, for me, I like to point out is that, as much progress as particularly, African-American Black individuals in the United States have had progress, there has been racial racism, anti-Black racism that's equally progressed and only become more entrenched and more sophisticated.
A sort of resentment towards the success that y'all have had.
It's equal. It's just equal. Like we take a step forward and racism takes another step forward. You know, it's checks and balances. So just as much progress, like we have somebody, you know, a Black president, well, then the next is the most racist president that we've ever had. You know, the system is ticking at the same. And so this big blow up of the protests that are happening all over is sort of like, of course, it's absolutely necessary. And I'm really glad that it's happening because there's so many places that are sort of waking up to the conversations, like you said earlier, that need to happen, that have needed to happen, that have always been there. You know, these issues have always been there, and a lot of people have grown just complicit to the understanding that we live in a racist country and everything's messed up. That's not the way it's supposed to be or has to be, you know, and so the pressure cooker had to blow, and I think that's what has happened.
Yeah.
But it's not exposing actually anything new. We've been fighting the whole time. No,
yeah, I mean, I go back to my conversation with John Nichols, where he tells me that, he tells us all that, you know, systemic racism is capitalism.
Absolutely.
You know, and it's geared, it's designed to keep certain people in oppressed, you know, in certain boxes.
Well, commodifying. I mean, that's the whole thing. I actually was in a really deep conversation with a performer that I'm going to be doing a piece with soon, actually in September, that's addressing some of this. But we were talking about that. I mean, the commodification of bodies, of particularly Black bodies, but brown bodies, indigenous bodies. You know, that has been the number one capital for like this country, for the United States of America, you know, as a colonizing force. Like they have all of the economy of the United States is built on the bodies of Black, brown, and indigenous people, and on the lands and resources, you know, and so everything has been extracted. Our actual beings and bodies have been extracted and can capitalize on, and that is colonization. That is one of the main tools of colonization.
What you're saying right now, I'm a 90s, you know, I grew up in the 90s. I was in high school in the 90s. I'm a 90s guy. And during that whole time, I remember everybody, you know, white kids shouldn't be listening to hip hop because that's our music, and, you know, that kind of stuff like that. I'm kind of seeing like a reflection in what you're saying in particular to that. Is that what you mean by commodifying and like cultural appropriation kind of stuff?
Cultural appropriation is a big part of it, absolutely. And that's yes, with Black culture, you know, or, you know.
Even Hispanic culture.
But even Hispanic culture.
The skull candy stuff.
Totally. Basically, colonization, it's constantly and still working. Anything that comes up that's interesting in another culture, the colonization believes it can take it, appropriate it, and then make it its own and make money off of it. And that's happening with everything. I mean, even like, you know, big feather headdresses, you know, on the catwalk, and, you know, things like this, people not even understanding that is, like how deep the stories of every single feather, every single bead is to, you know, an indigenous person. You know, capitalism, make money, yes, that's one piece. And then commodifying and taking land, you know, and creating industries on which, I mean, it's long stories, you know, of taking land and taking that. But then it's also colonization is present in, I mean, everything. I mean, you can look at it, you can see it in fashion, you can see it in art, you can see it in almost every realm of our society is based on stealing something from Black, brown, or indigenous culture and commodifying it. Right. And the bodies themselves, I mean, if we go all the way into even the slave trade, we know like that's actual hard numbers, like the buying and selling of Black, brown, and indigenous bodies, and that money directly feeding the building of the country, directly feeding all of the industry that America now, as the superpower of the world, you know, is based on, was the buying and selling of bodies and cheap labor.
Word. No, word. I feel that. I mean, you know, we're sitting here in the Cow's house, and, you know, there's a lot of paintings of my people in this household that those families probably won't ever see a dime from. Now, maybe that'll change, you know, with these kind of conversations that we're having. Hopefully that will kind of shine a little bit of a light on that. Now,
Yes.
we were talking about Trump for a second there. What's your opinion on the way he's handling things?
I'm definitely anti-Trump, and I have no problem saying that. I feel like his way of handling everything that's happened since he's come into the presidency has been consistent in its racism, in its ultimate damage to both to the environment, to immigration, to indigenous rights, to Black bodies. I mean, from every single policy he's made, every single direction he's gone in his executive orders, in his behavior, in his way of inciting violence and encouraging white supremacy, and on and on and on. He's been devastating.
You think he'd been able to sit down and talk with me?
Him?
Yeah.
I don't think he. I mean, to be honest, and so I guess it's fine saying these things publicly. I hope, but I think that you're too smart for him. Like the questions that you ask and things you're saying, he would actually have no idea how to answer and would not be able to answer you because he's very much, I think, narcissistic and only focused on what serves him and what gives him more power. And so he's not interested in the questions. I don't think he'd actually be able to understand the questions, to be able to answer them, because he hasn't ever thought outside of his own bubble.
Well, I'm holding off on telling the public what my personal feelings are until the end of this whole project is done. No, it's okay. It's good when I give my piece. But the reason I asked is because I've interviewed several people already, and people are one side or the other. Very much to one side or the other on their opinion of President Trump. But one interviewee in particular, Larry Torres, talked about how he reminds him of like a scared child. Absolutely. Somebody who is insecure and doesn't really know what to do with the situation that they've been given. And talked about
I think it gives him too much credit.
Yeah. I'm saying? It's okay, man. We know you're scared. Let's be scared together. And that struck me because I've never had anybody put it to me that way. Mm-hmm. That we really don't, and it really kind of draws towards the whole, you never know what's going on in a person's life. You never know what they're going through. I mean, you see those pictures of like Robin Williams smiling, and then caption underneath says, "This is what depression looks like."
Of course.
So I often wonder what his state of mind is, his consciousness, his, when it comes to these things. And that's why I ask these questions. That's why I ask everybody what their opinion about how he's handling things are. Not so much, the individual himself, but the actions that have been taking place. But you hit the nail on the head with, you're right, his executive decisions, the way he's moving, his maneuvering. His
probably the choices that he's making.
Even right down to his choice of words.
His choice of words, his choice of, exactly, and his continual choice of racist words and racist provocations, his, choice of advisors and people who's with, everything, the whole show of it is problematic. But I do want to just comment on what you said, because I think it's really important. Like, one of the things that I understand in my life and teach with my kids is that when somebody's hurting you, like, you do want to, like, I think anybody who's hurting me, they can only hurt me because they themselves are hurting. And so instead of like responding in anger towards that person for hurting me, like the first impulse has to be a response of compassion, because you know that they're hurting. I had abuse in my life as a child, and I know that my abuser, my father or stepfather at that time, was hurting himself, and that's not making an excuse for abuse. That's the main thing, is like, how do we not make an excuse for the abuse that Trump is perpetuating on the world? At the same time as, yes, hold him in compassion and recognize that he is, for whatever reason, probably in great, great pain, And so I said it's too much to say a scared child, because I believe children, there's a lot of complexity in children and children's emotions, but I think that some of his pain might come from his childhood. Who knows? Like, that's his own journey of understanding the psychology, which I have, don't want to go in, but I can recognize compassionately that he's in pain, and because if he was joyful in his life and felt good and was loved and nurtured, I believe that that love and nurturance would come out of him in his way of caring for people, And I don't see that. I see what's coming out of him is a lot of pain, a lot of anger, a lot of confusion, a lot of instability, a lot of things that are problematic for running a country and problematic for supporting people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad you said all that. I mean, I've seen a lot of the comments that were made about you, and some of them were very, very, very just, I don't even want to think about them. After the action that was taken on the plaza, and it's very pleasing to me to hear you say these kind of things, because now I understand that you are coming from a place within your heart and your soul. And I think those of you that may have had some negative comments about Miss Breeze's approach might want to rethink those comments at this time. Thank you for saying those words. That was very good. I think that was not the line in the sand, but erasing that line in the sand. Mm-hmm. So we're all hurting in a way, and I think the president is no different. When I look at some of the things the president has done and the criticism that he's taken on, I think about my dad, because right now my dad is the governor of our tribe, and he's had to make some very difficult decisions recently, especially with the pandemic. Yeah. It couldn't have been easy for our tribal leadership to close our borders. It couldn't have been easy. It wasn't an easy decision. And there's some other things that have happened in our tribe this year that I know have taken a toll on him. And a lot of the times, I just want to hug him because I know he's dealing with some difficult decisions. So thank you for saying those words. Now, what solutions would you like to see implemented to heal the ancestral trauma of minority groups, not just here in Taos, but around the country?
I feel like there's so many layers of what healing looks like. I know that there's, work in institutions to, begin to implement, land acknowledgements, before commencements and things like this that are very good and very important, but not enough. I think that, there should be ways that we begin to implement really long-term plans for restructuring and building in all of the honoring and all of the acknowledgments that are necessary to be able. I guess I'll come back a little bit. I think that we can't even talk about healing until we stop perpetuating pain. Okay. And that's one of these things where, Malcolm X has, which again is obviously a controversial figure, but some of his statements were very clear, and there's one that's become very, popular around the knife. If you stick a knife in 9 inches into my back and you pull it out 6, you can call that progress, but it's only, I'm still stabbed. I am still hurting. I'm still, even if you pull it all the way out, what about the process of the grieving? We have to stop hurting. We have to stop the perpetuation of racism in every one of its forms and oppression. And we need to, then we need to grieve the loss, which is immense. And then we begin to think about what healing looks like. Like any wound. The wound has to bleed too. And then the wound has to stop bleeding. And so we need to look at, I think, our restructuring of and dealing with ancestral trauma for minority groups and all group, like we have the trauma of the land, the trauma of minorities, the trauma that's experienced by, even Anglo and white, colonizers. There is trauma perpetuated and perpetuating. We need to stop that. So that's the first step. Stop it. and learn what that means. Because a lot of us don't know. That's the education piece. Like, how do we stop it when we don't even know how to name it? So the first thing is like these conversations. How do we name where is the pain being perpetuated? How, in the smallest organization, the smallest relationship, are we perpetuating these racist ideas or these oppressive ideas or these, sexist or, on and on, misogynist, transphobic, homophobic ideas? Like, where are we doing it? Stop it. Try to break down all of the different ways that are contributing to it continuing, and then grieve it. And the grieving is the part that is the hardest part, because it's the deep recognition of what has happened and what has happened from the beginning of this.
Word. Yeah, no, I feel you, because even I've said this in previous interviews that, there's a big part of me that's not necessarily doing this project for everybody else, but there's a big part of me that's doing this for myself.
Yeah.
Because I myself am guilty of those kind of prejudices. I've realized that. I've recognized that in my life, and I'm trying to stop it.
Yeah.
And this is kind of my way of doing that. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that. It's not just jumping into the healing and saying, okay, it happened, now let's move on from it.
Right.
You can't just get over it, as so many Native Americans have been told.
And so many Black people being like, you're still upset about slavery? Well, yeah, it's still happening. Like, we still have the largest prison population in the freaking world, and they're mostly Black and brown people. Like, yes, I'm still upset about slavery. It's still happening. It's still killing my people.
Yeah, same thing with me. I'm still, my culture gets appropriated left and right.
Exactly.
Victoria's Secret.
Yeah, and your lands are still being decimated and, being drilled and their waters being destroyed and their ancestral lands being ripped up and their everything.
Yeah, so I feel you. So in that way, I want to ask you how we stop it in the first place. But I think my next question kind of leads into that. And it has to deal with the statues. Mm-hmm. There's around the entire country right now, people are calling for the removal of certain historical monuments, certain historical figures. Mount Rushmore, Robert E. Lee, Columbus. Mm-hmm. Here in New Mexico, we had a shooting in Albuquerque over the removal of an Oñate statue. And even right here in Taos, there's been calls for the removal of the Kit Carson name from the park, the Padre Martinez statue from the plaza. And before I ask you how we stop all that, because I think this may tie into that question as well, but just your opinion on what's the best approach to meet these demands for the removal of these monuments, particularly here.
Yeah, I think it's really an important call to remove them, and the removal of them should be like the actual education about who they were and why they should be removed, like the recognition of what these figures have done in history, like that it hasn't been taught, like again there's the whole thing like we have these statues to teach the history, but what history? What history and how many histories are not taught and why aren't they taught? Like, I would love to hear and know like all of the histories and the stories from the mouths of the indigenous people about what happened, who Kit Carson was, rather than, the ones that we hear in the history books, and when we have all of that, then we decide, do we want a monument to this person? Well, probably not, if we're going to be honoring all of the story, right? And if there's importance of honoring the story and having the history, great. That should go in possibly in a museum to, this part of our history. But then we also need an equal museum to the other parts of the histories. We need as much education as possible. We need as much acknowledgement as possible. Like the thing that is so upsetting is that, a lot of particularly people don't even recognize why some of these monuments have been erected and when they were. There's all these, especially throughout the South, a lot of the Civil War monuments that are being taken down. Those were erected in the 60s and 70s. Particularly as a scare tactic. Yeah. They were never about preserving the histories. If it was about preserving histories, then we would actually have real history taught in school, which we don't. We have isolated colonist history taught in school. And so we're not actually, if you're really about history, then teach it all. Then do the diligent work of actually collecting those histories, finding those lost histories, talking to people and building what our histories that have been taken from us back, and then teach that, I think that it's absolutely imperative that we remove statues when, that are constant reminders of pain, genocide, and suffering to people. They should be removed.
Right.
And the history should be taught, the whole history.
Education has been coming up in all of our conversations. It's turning out to be the key to all of this, I think. And in our previous conversations, every single one of our interviewees has mentioned education as being an outlet or the pathway to teaching people the real story behind some of these monuments, behind some of these historical figures that are depicted in these monuments.
Yeah.
And then again, there's also some people that have talked about the fact that it is still someone's work of art. But then that brings into the question, does that particular work of art need to be in a public display? Or should it not be in a museum with context?
Yeah, it should be within context.
Word.
Yeah, being held as something that is owned by the government, owned by the state, presented as a symbol of whatever. Like what is it a symbol of? Why I think those questions need to be asked. Why the public is putting up symbols or not. If you're putting up a symbol to inspire people, then why not put. Again, a symbol being a sculpture, a monument, whatever it is you're making. If it's about honoring, or if it's about, what is it for? If it's about honoring, it should be honoring the people of that land, or honoring the stories of that place, or honoring, something that is not about genocide, and murder and war, and it should be about triumph. It should be about.
All right. So, well. Now that we're on that and we're talking about, honoring and where these certain monuments should be placed and in what way, how does one honor the suffering of the oppressed while preserving history?
I think that's what I was saying. There's again, we say preserving history. What history are you trying to preserve?
Well, I mean, not you. I'm a firm believer that if a person doesn't know their past, they're doomed to repeat it.
That's what I mean.
And it's like, if we get rid of all the Robert E. Lee, if we get rid of all the Columbus statues, 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years from now, how are we going to teach, how do we teach that to our children?
But right now, it's not being taught by those statues. Those statues aren't the things or the places that are teaching those stories. And we don't need those statues necessarily to remind us of those histories. I think that that's a twofold thing. Our teaching of history from grade school all the way through PhD in college, those histories need to be radically restructured and expanded. The histories that are taught, the histories that we're preserving, the histories that we know, the stories, as I said, are this. We always say that it's always the victor who writes the history. The current Macmillan books. Yeah, whatever. No, but the histories themselves are not. They are the colonizers' histories. They are. They just are in America. The curriculums that are taught are the colonizers' curriculums. There is so much more history. There are so many more stories and other sides of the story that are not in our curriculums right now. There's whole swaths of things that have happened. I was just talking about recently was it the Churchill explosion? What's the name? It was just in this conversation we were talking about nuclear reactor explosions, and there was one that happened on indigenous land that nobody knows about. But it was almost as big as Chernobyl. Like there's like things, and I'll try to get that reference for you. Because that's it. It's like there's so many histories that have been ignored, that have been left out of history, and so I think that we need to radically revamp our teaching of history to include indigenous history, include Black history, include Mexican histories as world history in its entirety, especially, and if we're teaching about this region, like all of the layers.
Taos history.
In Taos history, if we're talking and teaching in Taos, it should be real Taos history.
Well, I mean, I had this conversation with Ann McNaughton previously, and we were talking about how there really should be a sort of curriculum, a really deep curriculum about, and something that can be taught at an elementary level, something that can be taught at a high school level,
all the way to PhD.
Yes, exactly.
The whole history needs to be retaught, and that is how we preserve history, is to expand history to actually include what happened, like real history, and then we can see like. Of course we want to support art. We should have sculptures all over the place. We should have the whole place full of statues of the indigenous warriors that fought in this way, the people who stood up to oppression. We should have the artists filling the streets with ways to honor each other and our struggles. We shouldn't have it isolated to Columbus with an incredibly complex genocidal history as being the image that we need to somehow remind us of our history. No, we need to actually learn our history, and then we need to erect, appropriate statues.
Righteous, yeah. No, I feel that because it's like I said before, it's been a very big part of all our conversations. Education and reform. Reforming that education, particularly history. Mathematics is pretty universal, and there needs to be some administrative educational reform as well. But in regards to history, the whole book needs to be rewritten. The whole book needs to be rewritten.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Right on. So, this has been our big question for everybody. And you talked about it a little bit earlier about how Taos isn't just the three cultures. It's not. It hasn't been the three cultures for a long time. Since the very beginning, I would wager. Mm-hmm. Right? So what steps does Taos need to take in order to protect its most unique quality, its cultural diversity?
I think I have talked about that a little bit. I think that we touched on it. I think that our Taos schools should really be interested in looking at how to change and grow their curriculum and the way that they teach. So the actual teaching needs to be expanded in Taos, and Taos can do that.
So like the method itself.
The method of teaching, what they're teaching, what the curriculum is, how they build it out, how much time they give to particular units. There should be a huge unit on Taos Pueblo history that's taught by Taos Pueblo people in the schools.
That would be probably pretty difficult because of how closed off we are about speaking about certain things.
Of course, and it'd be your choice, like what you would share or not share. But how right now, if we're learning our history from white people about you, that doesn't make much sense. If the kids are not learning the right histories, then that's going to perpetuate misconceptions and prejudice within the community. So the right histories need to be taught. Then, and all of the education needs to be looked at as far as how the schools are supporting, and are sensitive to different cultural experiences. So, all the schools should know all of the Pueblo holidays, and all of the kids should automatically be given off school for that. That should be baseline. Kids, should understand all of the religious holidays that are happening, I think that there needs to be a widening of expansion and integration to make the schools feel more supportive of this community and what this community needs. I think that, and that would be, I think the schools should be interested in that. in actually going, I mean, like, how do we make our school really more inclusive and more widely knowledgeable of where we're at and how, what we're doing and how we're teaching and how we're creating space for our students. That's one. I think that all of the town of Taos, as far as town council, county commissioners, the chamber, all of these places that are sort of creating the image of Taos, that they also it needs to be a very diverse council that's coming up with that looks like, as Taos is inviting more people to move here. What are they inviting them to? Like, how are we shaping whatever progress is supposed to happen in a town? How is that taking into account every single voice of this community as we grow? Like right now, like what is the demographics really? And how are these things being, talked about?
I would actually like to see like a council, like an inner village council.
Yeah.
Because, right now our town government is comprised of people that live, I would have to say probably within, Taos proper. I'd like to see some representation from Arroyo Hondo. Mm-hmm. I'd like to see a representative from Red River, mm-hmm. from my own tribe, yep. that can come together and be a true Taos County council. Yeah. Even a representative from Eagles Nest, a representative from up Taos Canyon, a representative from Ranchos, from Llano, Talpa.
Exactly, because we know
Weimer area.
Yeah, that every single one of these areas has really different concerns, really different ways of ways that they need Taos to support them.
Well, check out my conversation with Larry Torres, where we talk about how the people from Ranchos weren't always called the people from Ranchos, and the people from Taos Pueblo weren't always called the people from Taos Pueblo. They had these different little nicknames for them. So, but see what I mean? But we're all still one big community, we're Taos is comprised of all these different little individual villages, but we're all still Taos. Yep. And yes.
And we should all have a voice in how Taos grows, how the budgets are being formed, like where the money is going to support what. Like, we'd have all these conversations about defunding the police, nationally, what that looks like. Taos can also look at that. We can look at all, like how many police departments are actually working here, from the Pueblo to the sheriffs to the, town police to the county, like all of these organizations, they all get a lot of money.
and for the most part, as far as I know, they all get along. I know that in recent years, even my own tribe has allowed kind of like an interjurisdictional policy mm-hmm. to happen, to where now if a tribal member is detained by local PD, they have the option of having a tribal officer come and make the arrest, as opposed to being arrested.
Yeah, and that's great. That's great, and I think that cohesion is important between all of the organizations, especially those that are serving the public interest and public health and public safety. That's really good. But then we also need to look at okay, how much money are they getting now? How much money is going right now into Taos for mental health? I can tell you, there's really not. I've actually personally was reaching out for friends and family and found that Taos is severely lacking in mental health services. Oh, yeah. Severely lacking. Like we don't even really have, because Tri-County was disbanded and broken. Yeah. Like there's not even a place for people to go when they're in crisis. So we have all of this money going, it's disproportionate. We need to have mental health is a huge issue here in every single corner of Taos, and it's not being looked at, it's not being dealt with, it's not being seen. I was talking with my son last night because we've all been here 20 years, and we've seen people who've kind of come into town and been sort of okay or normal or like grew up here, and then all of a sudden they start going through mental health or homelessness issues, and they're then just wandering around the town, and there's no help for them.
No, yeah.
Like they can stay at the men's shelter a few nights, but not really after so long, and then what do we have? We have no services for homeless people here. We have no mental health services really here. It's very hard to get to. We have a very small place for drug abuse and addiction here that is overworked. There is major money that can be moved around to support this whole world, because again, as long as we are ignoring those things, we can't grow and heal. And
well, no, I feel you, because me and my wife have had that conversation so many times in the past about mental health. She used to work for Tri-County. And before all the funkiness started happening with them. So she got out of there before any of that hit. But we used to talk about it all the time because it was just mind-blowing that there is so it is so severe in this humble little quiet town. And it's almost as if all of us turn a blind eye, turn the other cheek. And I'm guilty myself. I'm driving down the road and I see a mental health patient that I know is having trouble in that kind of way. And 9 times out of 10, I don't see them until I've driven past them. And I'm guilty of not stopping to help them. And I know it's not my responsibility to, but as a community member, a part of a larger group, it kind of is.
Yeah, it is. And we as, what can our town do? Well, that's something we can definitely do, is we can try to figure out, because even, again, my son and I, who's an amazing activist himself, we're talking about, he's like, well, what do we do? If there's no services really, is it just the kindness of somebody's heart to just take this person off the street and bring them into their house and take care of them? And is that what we're supposed to do? And I was like, well, some people do that. They'll take someone and kind of help them out and get through the steps. But even that person then needs help. They need somebody they can turn to. They need a service. They need something in the town, somebody to call to be able to be how do I help this person who's suffering? If a community member like yourself, if you were to pick that person up you saw on the street and be like, come on, let's get you some food. Are you going to do that every night? Are you going to give them a room? Are you going to let them move in with you and your family? Maybe not. But then what? You're going to just drop them back off on the street because we have no place to bring them.
That's exactly my point. What do you do?
We have money for that. Yeah. That's what the calls for defunding the police are. They're not calls for anarchy and no police and everybody arm themselves. It's about let's look at the budgets of money. We're giving a ton of money, over 300% of our budgets to public safety for police officers who have records of police brutality and abuse that are abusing these rights. And
not just that, DWI, domestic violence.
Everything. We need a force.
They're human.
Yeah.
They're human, just like the rest of us. So
we do. We need a police force. We need a force that is there to help support the dangerous things that are happening in our society, to support, and when there is violence, there does need to be sometimes somebody who can know how to de-escalate a situation, somebody who has the skills and has the training to be able to come into a place and not be afraid when there's violence is coming towards them and know how to calm somebody down. We need a really well-trained force of public safety keepers that their main job is how can they most compassionately, most safely handle people in crisis. That's important. We don't actually need people with guns that are just going to shoot you for nothing. That's what we don't need. We need people who are there to take care of each other. That's what the police should be for. They weren't formed that way. They were formed as slave patrol to, say. But what they should be is really incredibly well-trained mental health professionals who can deal with violence and crisis. And then we also need mental health professionals who can deal with all the things that aren't violent. So we expand mental health. We defund the police by expanding training, expanding mental health, expanding equity and racial, training. We really make it so that everything is about taking care of each other.
I'm really glad you said all that, because for the longest time I've had this issue with defund the police. I'm not saying that I'm against it or I'm for it, but it's just that term, defund, that I think throws a lot of people off about the whole concept. No, we're not saying disband the police or get rid of them entirely or bring their budget down to a trickle where they can't operate. No, that's not what it is. So I'm glad you were able to clarify that for our viewers out there.
I'm glad it was helpful, because that is really what it is. It's saying, come on, everybody, let's stop. Let's look at the system and see what we're actually trying to do. What we're trying to do is take care of our community. We're trying to help people who are suffering from mental illness. We're trying to help people who are suffering from drug abuse and addiction. We're trying to help people who are homeless or suffering from placelessness. We're trying to help people who are suffering from domestic violence and abuse. and sociopaths who want to murder. I mean, that's the very minimum, like really what we're talking about police is all of those other things, and then there are violent criminals, rapists and violent criminals. But all of it can be looked at as a whole of care. How do we care for each other the best way? And a heavily armed, militarized, violent police force that through their records are not actually there to help people, that are consistently creating and violating and abusing people. Like, that's not what we need. You're right. So, again, I'm saying it again, but it's just that it's really important to know that defunding the police isn't disband the police. It's look at the system, renegotiate the budgets, put more money in towards community services, community support, community food and homelessness, services, community mental health services, community violent shelters.
I call real crime prevention.
Real crime prevention.
Yeah, because crime happens because of opportunity and desire.
Exactly.
So if there's no desire, there's going to be less opportunities.
Yeah. More job creation. Put the monies of the budget into creating more jobs that are helping, hopefully, the environment. Can we get brilliant, get smarter, and actually make a budget that's supporting our community? There should be jobs to implement solar across the town. That's a lot of jobs. And it helps our environment. And we should look at ways to make it so that's what defunding is. Is just, let's do real crime prevention and let's get smarter about how we actually grow as a community that is diverse and that is complex and that is hurting.
Awesome, man. Nikesha, this has been great. This has been awesome. This has been such a good conversation. I know we went a little off topic, talking about budget cuts and stuff like that. But it's all relative to our healing and moving forward as one community. So, is there anything else in regards to equality in Taos that you would like to share with the rest of the community?
I think that I think the really important thing for everyone individually, to be able to live in a more harmonious, culturally sensitive, diverse community, to help foster that we live in, is that we all do our due diligence of educating ourselves, of really trying to have conversations like this with your community, with people you see, try to in every way avoid assumptions and generalizations about a group of people, or looking at the ways that we are contributing in our own communities, in our own families, in our own selves to, to racial injustice, to gender injustice, to look at the ways that we are prejudiced. Because we all have it, like you said, we all have things in ways that we are coming into the world that are ignorant. And we need to become, ignorant really in the root of ignoring something. Mm-hmm. So we need to be willing, that's what I say, we really all have to be willing to look at that honestly and to do the work to try and be better, to try and learn more, and to be open to learning more. And that's the beginning, because when we do that, what happens is we start to grow compassion. We start to actually, when I can see what your life and what your story is, I can reflect it, into my own life, my own story. I can start to feel the same. Compassion is to feel with, so I can, feel with you. And when I can start to feel with you, then the way that I show up in the world is going to be greater. It's going to be better.
Kind of like what was said previously about, learning each other's differences and starting to recognize the similarities.
Yeah.
By studying each other that way.
But not whitewashing, saying well, we're all the same, or treat everybody equal. That's one of these things that comes up a lot. People are but I just treat everybody the same. And isn't that me being basically not racist. I just treat everybody equal. And what we say is no. By treating everybody equal, you actually are ignoring the specific person in front of you. If I treat everyone the exact same, I'm ignoring this one person's story, this indigenous story that is different. I kind of whitewash and imagine that everybody's experience is the same as mine. And that's just not true. And so, to treat everybody, we want to love everybody the same. We want to, really treat everyone the same, but we need to acknowledge everybody's differences and be able to recognize those differences at the same time. So you recognize difference, yet, hold everyone in equality. And, then, just that place where when we do feel for each other and feel with each other in compassion, then we can, we can grow.
Like Larry Torres was teaching us, you gotta love one another.
Yeah.
And loving a person, and he doesn't mean the physical way, neither do I, but loving a person means accepting those differences.
Yeah.
So I feel
and actually looking to support and sharpen them. This is one of those things that I was talking about in a class I was teaching recently around, and it was around personal relationships, but it goes into global relationships too, where sometimes like we come into a relationship with somebody and we both have really unique ways that we have really kind of specific ways. And that's often what attracts us, in the first place to a relationship. You're like, oh, you're interesting and different and cool, but when we come together, those sharpnesses, some of them can kind of rub each other wrong. And so to love each other, we think we kind of have to dull our sharpnesses. And eventually, if we're dulling our sharpnesses so as we can get along, we end up getting pretty dull. And it's like we just compromise and compromise and compromise. Oh, they didn't really like this part of me, so I'm going to change it. And we compromise down to the point where we actually aren't relating at all, and we both have lost what is special about us, right? There's this place where you basically shave each other off. And a healthy relationship would be one that, because then that ends up being unhealthy, right? Because neither person is really themselves.
Right.
They kind of just become one thing.
Right.
And neither are really happy. And that happens all the time. But if we come together with our differences, and instead of trying to like shave our differences off, which is, again, like that action on a social film is like passing, ultimately, in white colonist society, where, you'll try to do everything you can to fit into the white structure. Right, that's like cutting off your differences, and people expect you to do that, show up, and everyone should be the same.
Assimilate,
yeah. Exactly. So to not assimilate, to come in with differences, and to look at each other and say, like, how can I sharpen or understand or support that thing that's really unique and different about you more? So I want to look at you and like see all of your things that are really interesting and different, and ask you more questions about it. Ask you further to like explain or to help me understand how unique you really are. And that supports your uniqueness, rather than me being like, well, can you like not be like that? Can you be more like this? Or does that make sense? Like when we come into a relationship, if we can learn how to sharpen each other by being inquisitive, by being like joyously, desirous of somebody's difference, rather than wanting them to assimilate to be the same as us. And then you feel like that someone's doing that for you. If someone's looking at you and being like, wow, I really want to know about how cool and unique you are, and like how different, and how you think, how you would consider this, how you would think of this thing. Questions around that help support
embracing that difference.
Embrace the difference and actually want it, like desiring it. So if I desire your difference and you desire my difference, and you want to know more about it and I want to know more about yours, then we both end up being sharp and specific and unique, and we have a larger organism that grows, and we're all happy because we're getting supported in ourselves. And that's the same for a personal relationship.
I love it. This has been awesome. Thank you, Ms. Nikesha Breeze, for being a part of our conversations.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been, we could probably keep going for hours talking. I've really enjoyed this conversation. You offer us in Taos a very unique perspective, and I hope that the rest of the community can embrace that as much as I have today, because this has been a very eye-opening conversation for me, even in terms of like my own personal life. Talking about embracing differences. I'm gonna go home right now and give my wife a big hug and tell her how much I love her. Thank you so much. And thank you, Taos, for tuning in again. Please join us for our next installment coming to you next week. Not sure who it's going to be, so stay tuned and catch the surprise. Join us again here on Taos News YouTube channel in the Valle, Prejudice and Reconciliation. Taos, thank you, Taos, for being a part of it. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. This is Juan Concha. Talk to you later.